ready to restart? Yeah. Hope you all had a chance to refresh a bit. We'd like to start the second panel, which is aliens or humans, receiving the other in host countries, and that is chaired by Ala Mohammed from Asyut University.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to have you all, and I want to welcome you all to the second panel, which is about aliens or humans receiving the others in host society. First, I want to introduce myself to all of you all. My name is Ala Abdel Gawad. I am an associate professor and head of the Department of Political Science at Asyut University. I am also the coordinator of the Diploma in Public Policy and Child Rights at Asyut University. I am interested in the issues of child rights and also the issues of immigration in the Arab world. I am happy today because I have accompanied with four beautiful ladies. So
is that culturally correct?
I hope this session will be as rich as the first session was, and we have 5 speakers in this session. The first speaker will be Carla Randolph, Children's Rights Migration Officer, Defense of Children, and she will speak about child rights and immigration. You have 10 minutes, and you can introduce yourself in 1 minute. One more minute.
9 minutes.
I said that I should
You have
5 minutes, so I skipped on half of my speech, but it's okay. It's better to have discussion, I think, than just to introduce myself. So I work for Defense for Children. The international movement of Defense for Children currently operates in 14 countries worldwide. In the Arab world, we are represented in Lebanon and Palestine. I've been working for 6 years for the Dutch section of Defense for Children as a legal advisor on children's rights and migration. We support undocumented children, migrant children, and minor asylum seekers children in their fight for their rights. Since 2006, we've been working on a regularization campaign for undocumented children who stay more than 5 years in the Netherlands, and I will come back to that campaign at the end of the introduction. Just to give you a quick overview of the figures, I don't know if it was mentioned today already, but we have about 16.7 million people in the Netherlands. And 3.5 million of them have a migrant background. That means that they, or at least one of their parents, were born abroad. In 2011, about 11,000 people asked for asylum in the Netherlands, so it's a very small number compared to the community. The number of asylum seekers coming to the Netherlands has declined enormously. The migration policy became extremely strict here recently. In fact, the goal of this policy has been to send as many asylum seekers as possible back to their home country as soon as possible. This view is reflected in the Dutch Aliens Act, which says, to summarize, you are not welcome, except if we have to admit you due to international rules, or if we want to admit you because we think your presence will serve our country's interest. And this last reason has only been applied for famous footballers, sportsmen, and Princess Maxima. I think this way of reluctantly welcoming migrants by the authorities is also reflected in Dutch society. Since the last decade, we have seen a worrying growth of xenophobia and racism all over in different. Sorry, I moved too much. It's always my problem. Recently, the UN Human Rights Council has called upon the Dutch state to strengthen the fight for equal rights and to combat all forms of discrimination against migrants here in the Netherlands. However, the state doesn't seem to feel very ashamed at being criticized at human rights issues. Let's take a closer look on the situation of asylum seekers children in the Netherlands. We have about 5,000 asylum seekers children living in 40 asylum seeker centers all over the country. Most are located in remote areas far from urban regions. Some children spend their entire childhood in these centers. And I could spend hours on that, but let me just explain one destructive aspect of such a life. An asylum-seeking child has to move from one center to another on an average of once a year. This means starting at a different school, making different friends, find your way to a different sports club, and so on every year. Children tell us simply they stop making friends after a few moves, and they feel their school results are very below their capabilities due to the continuous changes in school systems and books and so on. And I guess it's clear what a grave effect on the intellectual, social and emotional development of these children and their identity this has. Moreover, the roles within the family changed gradually during these years in the asylum seeker centers. We see children growing towards a role of caregiver or even leader of the family. Often their parents were influential and successful in their home countries. They were on the front lines of human rights movements or came from the upper intellectual classes there. And in the Netherlands, the parents are not allowed to follow lessons, are not allowed to work, and in fact they are discouraged from becoming a member of Dutch society. And due to the fact that the children do learn Dutch and adapt a little bit more easily to their new environment, they become responsible for the daily life of the family. They call the lawyer, they speak with the reception manager, they translate the doctor's advice for the parents. And I think this has also a very strong effect on the identity of the parents and the children as well. It's not a happy story, I'm sorry. We have been working since 2006 for the rights of these children on legal residence. It violates their right to development and their right to respect for their identity if no durable solution has been found after years of residence in the Netherlands. Scientific research has shown after living in the host country for about 5 years, most children cannot be expelled without suffering damage. Hundreds of these children living in the Netherlands for a long time without a legal residence have united with the help of Defense for Children in a group which is called We Stay, and they fight together now for their rights. Their campaign has been very successful so far. There's even now a draft law to solve more or less their problems. But in the former parliament, this draft law couldn't count on a majority. And in the last week before the elections of 12 September, we had elections for the parliament. The children's group We Stay organized a very powerful election campaign. And since elections, there has been a 78 to 72 majority for this draft law. And we are waiting to see for the new governmental agreement to see if this law will come into immediate effect. At least the new majority in parliament made sure that during these negotiations no asylum-seeking child staying more than 5 years will be expelled. And we really do hope all those years of uncertainty and anxiety the children experience in our rich and so-called tolerant country will end, and that we can welcome these children as our new fellow citizens, enriching our identity as a multicultural society.
Thank you. You gave a brief on a very sensitive issue about immigration in the Netherlands, and I think that the discussions will add to what she said. The second speaker will be Mervat Faiz. She is from the Hashemite University, and Mervat will speak about Jordan as a host country. And you can introduce yourself first.
Okay, I'm gonna introduce myself here, but I'm gonna move up there.
Just grab the mouse.
You can't see what. But I can't see you. Okay, my name is Mervat Faiz. I work at the Hashemite University in the Queen Rania Faculty for Childhood. What else do you want to know? I'm presenting like a small thing about Syrian conditions in Jordan and Jordan as a host country. I would like first to say how glad I am to be part of an international discourse about children, their rights and their conditions. And one thing that I need to know, I'm a refugee myself. I am a Palestinian originally, but I live in Jordan. I never felt vulnerable. So just this is a comment on earlier discourse. Before I talk about the Syrian conditions in Jordan, we have to say something about Jordan. Jordan is a country in the Middle East. We have very limited resources. We're a non-oil producing country. We have a medium poverty rate. I can't say it's high, but and we're receiving others. We had so many trains coming to Jordan from Iraq, from Palestine earlier in 48 and 67. Iraqis very recently came in huge numbers to Jordan afterward, first the war. And we're receiving now so many refugees that come to Syria, that coming to Jordan from Syria. And it keeps and continues to host the largest Syrian refugees. Syrians are going into so many neighboring countries, including Iraq, Lebanon, but they're mostly coming to Jordan. To date, more than 7,000 people live in the tented Zaatari camp in Mafraq, north of Jordan. Zaatari is located in a very desert area in north of Jordan, the majority of whom are women and children. Most of the, a large number of these refugees are women and children. The number of Syrian refugees crossing to Jordan is rising every day. Every day the indicators and the numbers are rising. What rings the bell? That we already have a shortage in water and so many resources. Now we're even having an increase in shortage for water, for sanitation and hygiene, education, psychological and psychosocial well-being of children, health and nutrition, and child protection. These are very serious issues that are coming up in Jordan because of a decreasing number of refugees who are coming to Jordan. There is a need for all donor agencies. We're working with donor agencies, including the European Commission. We're working with USAID and Mercy Corps, a lot of institutions to work with refugees and to promote their level of living. They need to scale up their response to support governments in the sub-region. This is what we wish that happens, and it is actually happening. But I guess even with all the funds that are coming to Jordan, there is still lack of, of the services and conditions to these Syrians. What has been done up to now in regard to sanitation and hygiene? Jordan, through donor agencies, UNICEF and German Federal Agency for Technical Relief, are currently constructing 800 latrines and showers to meet the needs of 20,000 people. Over 20,000 people have benefited from safe wash facilities, solid waste management and hygiene and water conservation awareness sessions. A lot of things are being done in that regard. Among them is awareness sessions for people how to deal with water, especially water. This rings a bell in the country because we have a very shortage of water resources in Jordan. The only sea we have is the Dead Sea, and it's dead. Actually, it's very salty that we cannot use for our living conditions. So we don't have so many water resources, and that's why like we're depending on providing them with water is a very serious issue, and supporting them with the services that they need in that regard, with anything that relates to water, including hygiene and wash and everything that they need. For drinking, actually water is being trucked on a daily basis, and there is they want to build a well in the area. It's gonna work in winter, and it depends on the water, on the rain and things like that. So even this is still a serious issue. In regard to child protection, I'm not going to talk about the conditions of these children, but we know that they're now they're not guarded, and they need a lot of things to be done in that regard. 6,500 children and parents have benefited from psychosocial services, which are being presented through the family, like family counseling and sessions like that. There's also what has been called child-friendly spaces that are built. These are they made big areas where children can come together. They play, they dance, they do a lot of entertainment things. They express their feelings through plays and art, because these children, they suffer from a lot of psychological issues. I had a chance to visit the Zaidri camp 3 months ago, and I talked to many children there. You can't imagine the stories that they have told to us and how they feel. But as long as we help them to express their feelings, I think we are in the right direction. I know we're not gonna, erase everything they have witnessed, but at least we're helping them to come over it. Jordan and the supporting partners are also identifying and caring for children who fled Syria without their parents or their family. A lot of Jordanian families are not actually adopting, but at least they're helping these children. They're taking them and they are supporting them with all the services they need. In regard to education, the government of Jordan have granted access to all Syrian refugee children to attend the schools, but actually the numbers of these children are increasing in our schools. And our schools are in a condition that they're barely serving our own children. So UNICEF and Save the Children are facilitating the registration of Syrian refugees. Schools are being built in the tents, and this was the most the best solution that they could ever think of. So they have built a school in the tents. The Syrian teachers who have been teachers before the crisis began, they started teaching these kids in the tents. Even Jordanian teachers, they volunteered to help in regard to that. The European Commission announced a donation of 4.6 million to UNICEF for emergency education programs benefiting Syrian refugee children, as well as children of host communities. The donation brings up scaled up the donations of the European Commission. The new school includes 14 large tent classrooms, which are arranged in a compound. The school operates on double shifts, girls in the morning, boys in the afternoon. That would help increase the services, the educational services being provided. Extensive support to the school, including learning materials, school furniture, and tents, along with support for Jordanian teachers, are also provided by the Ministry of Education in Jordan.
What is the language of instruction? What language is used in tent schools?
Arabic.
So it's
Yeah, Arabic. Syrians are Arabs, and we're Arabs, so we use the same language. So there's no problem in language, there's no problem in, I don't know about religion, but I mean, as long as they can communicate well, That's what makes Jordan the first country for Syrian people, that we share a lot of the culture, we share language, we share religion. That makes it number one, actually. Health, as the number of children increase, the risk of disease outbreaks increases too. Ministry of Health is partnering with UNICEF and the World Health Organization to provide immunization for these children. This is a troubled area because we don't have record of the vaccination that they already took, and this increases also the troubles that they face to help these children. They're also working with partners to establish a regular vaccination program at the camp. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehmet. Mehmet spoke about the problems of children, refugees from Syria to Jordan, and the programs of the Jordanian programs to solve that problem. But in my view, the problem will not end until the international community is united to find a durable solution to the Syrian problem. Unfortunately, Syria has not got oil such as Libya, and so the problem goes on, and we. So thank you, Mehmet. The next speaker will be Roya Kashifi. Roya is from Iran, I think, and she has an Arabic name. Roya in Arabic means Roya means vision in Arabic.
Is it Ruqayya or Ruqya?
Roya means
Roya, vision, exactly.
It means vision
My parents
and
were
the
looking
Arabic
for such
language.
great things.
Roya is Roya Kashifi is a senior researcher and head of the Human Rights Committee of Association of in a French word, Association de Chercheurs Iraniens or UK asylum system and the plight of the Iranian asylum seeker. Yes, please, Roya.
Sorry, yeah.
I saw it just like
If you want to introduce yourself more than
I will
that, and then we can speak in 2 minutes.
Okay, I'm Roya Kashifi. I'm the head of Human Rights Committee of my organization. My organization has been working for the last 20 years researching into major issues that concerns the future of Iran. I'm here talking about Iran. I'm very aware Iran is not part of the Arab world, but we have a lot of similar issues with what is happening politically in Iran today, with what is happening in the Arab world since the Arab Spring, and also the plight of the unaccompanied minors in industrialized countries seeking asylum is similar regardless of whether they come from Iran or whether they come from any other country in the world. So although my personal experience is going to be talking about Iranian children claiming asylum within the UK system, the problems identified reflect a lot of what UNICEF and other organizations that have conducted research show to be the same for regardless of the country of origin where these children are coming from. So I'm going to be talking specifically about Iran. I'm going to talk about I conducted research in the year 2000 into the asylum system, and because of that I interviewed policymakers, those who enforce policy, and I worked with solicitors firms. Because of that, I formed a relationship with the Refugee Council, the Refugee Legal Centre in the UK that provided advice for these children and various other solicitors. Since then, if they've had issues, they've referred cases to me. Since year 2000, I've commented or have been consulted on over 550 cases. 10%, just over 10%, 56 of these cases have been of unaccompanied minors from Iran. So I'm talking about these 56 particular cases, their experiences of claiming asylum in the UK since year 2005, which is politically significant. And this is where I take off from where Anne Singleton left off, that what happens in the world affects what happens here in Europe with asylum seeking. So it's they're not mutually exclusive. What happens matters. In 2005, the Iraqi Kurdistan became autonomous, and Iraq also had a Kurdish president. That gave a lot of hope to the Kurdish region in Iran, and there was a lot of support for what was happening in Iraq, which made Iranian Kurdistan a very militarized and security-conscious region. And since then, there's been a flight of children from the region. So I'm very specifically talking about Kurdish children who have been through the asylum system in the UK and who have failed. So that's what I'm talking about. The transit that they've gone through, I'm not going to comment on that, and then I'm going to talk about the asylum system. So I will very briefly talk about the conditions that these children come from in Iran. The background of most of these children, their access to education has been limited. Iran, according to legislation, recognizes their cultural and religious and language rights, yet these children are not allowed to study in their mother tongues, and they have to learn Persian. For that reason, a lot of these families of these children didn't allow them to go to school, so they came to the UK illiterate. Some of them have been victims of landmines, or their families have been victims of landmines, again left over from the 8-year Iran-Iraq war. And their access to health and social welfare has been very limited because, again, Kurdistan is intentionally economically deprived, and a lot of political unrest goes on there. These children have complained about threats to their liberty and life. They're mainly male. Culturally, again, girls are not sent from the region. It's male, and I've dealt with cases from 8 to 17 and a half, 8 years old to 17 and a half. The 8-year-old was separated from his mother en route. So I won't talk about him, but just those who have failed. They've been victims of discrimination because of their religious. They're Sunni Muslims. Iran is predominantly Shia. The political system is Shia. And again, as Sunni Muslims, they're discriminated against. And because of the system in Iran, they feel disillusioned and disenfranchised. There's no hope for their future, so they do get involved and they fall victim to the kind of political and ethnic groups that work within Iran. They are targeted to become suicide bombers against the regime. So for that purpose, again, if a child is recognized to be from a political family, he becomes a target of the security forces. And if the father is killed or arrested or whatever, all attention goes on the child. So the families sometimes feel it's safer for the child to be out of harm's way. And they risk and send their children at great expense to European countries. So I'm talking about those who come to England. So this is where they're coming from. They arrive in the UK, to claim asylum. They have no English, they hardly speak Persian, they have no knowledge of the asylum system, so they don't know that, well, once they arrive in the United Kingdom, they're supposed to say, I claim asylum. And a lot of them who come and arrive at the port of Dover are returned either to France or to Belgium, because either they look like adults, the immigration officer at border makes a very random decision that they look like adults, so they're not referred to social services as they're supposed to. And because they haven't physically said, I want to claim asylum, they're not recognized as claiming asylum, and they're returned. Those who are recognized as children, or those who do say the word asylum, manage to go through the process. But a lot of them actually come through and they pass the ports of entry in the UK and they land somewhere in the middle of the United Kingdom. And then somebody in the street picks them up and they are taken to a police station, and then the whole system starts from there. These children are at great risk because if their age is disputed arbitrarily, they end up in detention until age assessment has been done properly, and then they can be moved out of detention. That's quite traumatic, what these children go through when they go through this wrongful age assessment. And all of the cases that I have worked with who have been in detention have since been released because they were recognized as minors once proper age assessment was made of them. And we've had children in detention for as long as 6 weeks at certain times. The younger ones, the ones below 16, have been placed in foster care, or they have some form of legal guardianship. What happens if they are recognized as a refugee, which is very rare, then they're granted status and they can stay in the UK indefinitely. but a lot of them are not granted refugee status. They're only allowed to stay in the UK until they reach 17 and a half, 18, and then they are deported, or they are threatened with deportation. So a lot of cases that come to me are from lawyers who are dealing for these children who are about to hit 18 and are going to be deported from the UK back to the place that they have fled from. These children report a great deal of anxiety. They are their future is very uncertain. They experience insecurity. They have a very unstable life because they don't know that once they hit 18, what's going to happen to them. And they have great fear. On the positive side, when these children, particularly the younger ones, the ones below 16, when they are placed with foster care or they have some kind of legal guardianship, they really flourish and they prosper. And although they are illiterate according to international standards, as soon as they are encouraged and they are supported to learn, their English language develops very well, they integrate really well into their community, they play in football groups and they do really well. Nevertheless, they have the anxiety and fear that very soon this is going to be finished and they're going to be passed over back to Iran. And that creates a huge amount of anxiety for them. And one of the main issues that has repeatedly come up is their lack of access to mental health support, because they need a lot of support to be able to overcome the kind of anxiety and mistrust that they have of the system and this constant fear that they're going to be returned. One of the main problems that we have with these children is because they come from rural areas with limited access to telephone, so they've become estranged from their families from Iran as well, because they have no way of contacting their family members in Iran. So it's a huge amount of problem, and they, because of their age, particularly the younger ones, they integrate very well, and this fear that as soon as they become 18, they're going to have to go to an unknown environment is very worrying for them. I have some policy recommendations based on my own experience, again, with these children. A lot of them, they feel there are a great deal of obstacles for them to access appropriate services which would offer them effective protection. So it's really important for policymakers to look at this and to remove these kind of obstacles, like the fact that these children don't know what claiming asylum means or what the process is, actually prohibits them from asking for help or getting the right kind of help, unless they have a carer who will look after their rights and is able to provide for them. Definitely we need to improve their access to mental health services, because a lot of them would benefit from that. A lot of these children who've come through to me, it's haphazard. It's only because the lawyers that are caring for them or looking after them know me personally because of something I did in the year 2000. I act as a catalyst and put them in touch with various other Kurdish groups and whatever, but I only see, or certain limited cases are referred to, and there are many others who don't necessarily have that kind of contact. And I think, again, it's really important to improve their contact with community and peer groups, particularly, again, in the United Kingdom. One of the things that we experience, because these children are dispersed throughout the United Kingdom, but particularly in England I'm talking about, there is a great deal of disparity between local authorities in how they're dealing with these children. Some are dealt with and looked after very well, some aren't, depending on where they are. Again, some of them, according to where they've been placed, are victims of racism and bullying and all that sort of thing. Some aren't. So it very much depends on the child, where they've been placed and who's looking after them. And this is arbitrary, and again, we need to be able to streamline that so all local authorities behave in the same way and offer the same kind of services, support and protection for these children. There are strong contradictions between child welfare laws and immigration legislation in the UK. Again, we need to get rid of that and to bring immigration laws where it deals with children in line with child welfare laws. And efforts to improve the very unpopular image that asylum seekers have. They're like parasites, they're taking our money, they're taking our homes, they're taking our jobs. So there are a lot of negative aspects to asylum seekers. And so it's important to overcome that. So we need some concerted effort in media coverage of reporting on them in a different way. And the kind of key question that I have goes back to what we were discussing with Anne Singleton. And we can't look at these children, not just Iranian asylum seekers, Iranian unaccompanied minors, all asylum seekers in general, but particularly minors. We can't look at them in isolation. We can't just say, okay, they have landed from Mars in the United Kingdom. We don't care about what's happened over there. It is not over there. It's our trade policies, it's our economic policies, it's this globalization of trade and economy that actually affects the lives of these children. They are persecuted where they live, and because of the policies that we have here, once they get here, they don't receive the right protection that they should be getting. And those who do manage to get the protection prosper really well. So the question that I want to throw to the floor is the shared responsibility. What is the shared responsibility for the 44 industrial countries that are host to all the asylum seekers internationally, but specifically the 27 EU states, who have very different asylum policies in dealing particularly with children? They are all signatory to various international conventions. All European countries are signatory to CRC, but they have national laws. That means how they interpret the international obligations differ from country to country. And for example, we just heard that in Netherlands, they're kept in detention centers or in asylum hosting units, whereas in the UK, they're dispersed within families. So there are very different ways of dealing with these children. So, but my question is, what is the responsibility for these countries in actually supporting dictatorships, governments that actually oppress their own citizens, that gives rise to migration, to asylum seeking, and to these children of families risking the lives of their minors, of their children, into an uncertain country where they have no idea of their culture and what's going on, but they still feel it will be safer for the child to be in this unknown than remaining in a country where they could be persecuted, imprisoned, and then killed. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank Roya for the Roya or the vision she presented regarding the problem of Iranian seekers, asylum seekers in the UK, and also for the recommendations she presented regarding the ways to solve, or the policy recommendations to solve this problem. Now I move to Shadin Khalaf. Shadin is an adjunct professor at the AUC, the American University in Cairo, and the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies. She will speak about the protection space in the Middle East and North Africa, refugee youth in focus. 10 minutes, and if you want 1 or 2 minutes to introduce yourself more gently.
Thank you very much. I think you did very well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here and to meet all of you.
I hope it's gone. Just hit escape. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'll be talking about this afternoon is just try to explain a little bit first here. What I'd like to start off with is contextualizing a little bit the context of asylum in the Middle East and North Africa by describing what the pre-spring, what I call the Arab winter conditions were for refugees and asylum seekers. Then I want to talk a little bit about the fragility of the protection regime in the region. And then look, I mean, this is a lengthy discussion, I'll try to limit it as much as possible, about the impact of the revolutions and the spring on the conditions of asylum and protection and human rights in general, and of course, child's rights and conditions of youth, the particular challenges and needs of youth in the region and in this overall context, and then existing strategies to deal with them, and some policy recommendations at the end. I had planned on a little bit more than 10 minutes, so I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can. Okay, so we're all familiar with the context in the region, right? It's the Middle East and North Africa is an area that has been rife with volatility and conflict, whether intra-national conflict or internal conflict, poverty, unemployment, security-centric forms of governments, largely, and this is an element that I'll come back to in a minute. And traditionally, or before the spring, before the Arab Spring, an absence of transparency and a dearth in a lack of democratic systems of governance, right? And as a result, numerous human rights violations across the board. We also know that the region hosts some of the world's largest and most protracted, or the longest standing, refugee groups in the world. So we have the Palestinians, obviously, the largest and most, the longest standing. We have the Iraqi refugee groups. We have Western Saharan asylum refugees in Algeria, large numbers of Somali refugees in the region, Sudanese, Yemeni internal displacement. So a region that is full of displacement all throughout. At the same time, and despite this very pervasive presence of refugees throughout the region, we have very informal or ad hoc systems of dealing with refugees and asylum and refugee protection overall. So this, in my opinion, leads to a great deal of fragility and unpredictability in how asylum is managed in the region. The large majority of countries in the region have not acceded to the international legal framework that is supposed to govern asylum, and there are no national asylum institutions or national legislation that manages asylum in most of the countries in the region. So as a result, there is a bit of a legal vacuum, a legal gap. Some consider this to be an advantage in the sense that it gives governments the flexibility to react to each refugee situation according to its conditions and according to the situation. However, this also, in my opinion, leads to an absence of accountability and an absence of predictability in knowing how a refugee is going to be treated in any given country at any given time. We also have a region that is characterized by reactive policies, ones that are emergency-based in relation to asylum influxes. The international community continually finds itself trying to stop a certain crisis from expanding. It's never a longer-term planning for emergencies. It's always reactive and firefighting, if you will. Now, the security-centric element of governance means that we don't have a rights-based approach, or traditionally, again, so far before the spring. Let's see how things evolve now after 2011 and 2012 in countries where the revolutions have taken place. The management of borders and control over territory has traditionally taken precedence over individuals' rights. So this very much manifests itself when we look at policies governing who is allowed to enter the country and who is not allowed, and what are the requirements for asylum seekers to enter, and so forth. We also have deep-seated identity issues that are, and sensitivities about demographic balance, where the influx of refugees often tends to be perceived as a threat to existing balances or existing fragile and sensitive issues about identity, and as a result about livelihood and sustainability. And if we just take an example of Lebanon, for instance, where you have 17 different sects that make up the country, and where the governance structure is divided according to the presumed numbers of each of those sects. So the presence of Palestinians, for instance, who belong to the Sunni majority, who are Sunni, and who would, if naturalized in the country, if allowed to remain permanently, would completely upset the existing very fragile demographic balance. Okay, so yeah, we've spoken about the lack of democratic governance to date, and even in the countries where revolutions have taken place, they still remain very much, obviously, in flux. They are fluid. We still don't know in which directions they will lead the countries that they have taken place in, and as a result, it is very difficult to place future recommendations on policy making related to asylum and refugees, but we're trying. Another general kind of contextual element is the urban context in which many asylum seekers and refugees find themselves in the Middle East. There are, of course, many large and well-established camps for Palestinian refugees mainly, But besides that, many states have a non-encampment policy, which means that refugees mingle and are kind of dispersed throughout the major urban centers of the countries, which makes access to them much more difficult than in a camp. It makes outreach in terms of figuring out what their needs are and planning for those needs more difficult. And they, as a result, in many instances, the refugees themselves become more marginalized, they become more isolated, and they try, in many instances, to remain invisible and distant from the society within which they are living. One final comment, kind of just on the general fragility and protection context, is that refugees, as well as the host governments in the region, tend to view their presence as transitory or temporary in the countries that they are being hosted in currently. And there is this kind of fear of Palestinization, if you will, if I can create that or use that term. The fear of the refugee status or the refugee presence becoming so entrenched and so long-term and so lacking in terms of a final solution that you create another mini Palestinian refugee situation. So this diminishes this sense of, no, we don't want to become like that, creates both on the parts of the refugees a lack of interest or a lack of will even to be proactive in creating the ties that would help them integrate with the societies they are living in. And at the same time, for the governments, the position is always that the international community has to help resolve this burden, resettlement has to take place, we are not going to host these people for very much longer. But of course, as we know, this does not end up being the case, unfortunately. So, and of course we had the revolutions. This is a famous picture of Tahrir Square in Egypt. And the questions that many people pose today about the relationship between the revolutions and asylum, and then eventually we'll get to the children and refugee youth aspect. So will the revolutions create a positive influence on policies and laws regarding asylum and protection in the region? Will there be wider space to advocate for human rights in general and specifically including refugees, or are we seeing a heightened sense of nationalism on the part of the communities and societies where the revolutions have taken place that is to some extent exclusionary, kind of closed in, introverted, as opposed to one that is inclusive of others? Do we think that more democratic electoral systems mean that international human rights laws will be more respected? Does democracy necessarily mean greater respect for human rights? These are questions that we should think about. What will be the perspective of Islam's dominated regimes on asylum and protection, knowing that, as I mentioned earlier, there is a long tradition of asylum in Islam? Will this become translated into policies and laws related to asylum in the region? We have yet to see. What will be the impact on gender and minorities and so on? So these are things that I just think are very important to think about. Maybe I'll go through this quickly in the interest of time. Just to think again about the impact of the revolutions on refugees in general in the MENA region, we have three groups in my view. We have existing refugee groups who were in these countries prior to the outbreak of the revolutions and who remain there and have their existing set of challenges. We have people who were internally displaced by the revolutions, so in Yemen and in Syria, for instance, large numbers of IDPs. And we have fresh outflows resulting from the violence, such as the conditions in Libya and in Syria. And we just heard from Everett about the conditions of the Syrians in Jordan. As a result of the revolutions, as I just mentioned, there is some researchers, some analysts have noted a rising sense of nationalism that has also been accompanied by a certain degree of xenophobia, unfortunately, and suspicion of anything and anyone that is external, that is alien, that is potentially influencing or directing behind the scenes the direction of things on the ground in the countries where revolutions have taken place. So suspicion and xenophobia towards the other, the alien. And this is, of course, affecting refugees directly in a very negative way. I've heard several stories of refugees in Egypt, for instance, who have been facing harassment and sexual abuse and violations that they perhaps witnessed before, but not to the extent that they're witnessing now. This is partly due to this rising xenophobia, unfortunately. And so there are a great deal of heightened concerns about security. And of course, as refugees, their recourse to proper legal mechanisms and to the social networks of support that would normally exist to the local population are absent. As a result of the economic decline, which has accompanied a lot of the revolutions, countries undergoing revolutions, there is also much more limited opportunities for livelihood, even where they did exist before. We've seen a large number of cases of evictions from homes in Egypt, for instance, of refugees who are no longer able to pay the rent and who previously received a bit more flexibility from the landlords in terms of managing that gap, but now there is no more tolerance, unfortunately, of this. Okay, so let's see. Quickly now, particular conditions of refugee youth in the region. I'll be using a definition that includes youth between the ages of 15 and 29, mainly to capture the transition of youth to adulthood, and then from the transition from completing a principal higher level of education until the phase of employment and marriage in some cases. All right, so we know that there are general international guidelines on what priorities for dealing with refugee children and youth should be. The UNHCR has 5 priorities. UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, has 10 commitments to refugee youth. So I won't go through this now in detail. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. But just to see whether these priorities are in fact properly implemented on the ground. Consistently, the two needs of refugee youth that emerge throughout the region, and probably more generally beyond the region, are learning and earning. So basically completing an education or receiving some form of education on one hand, and then being able to earn a living, find a job, have some kind of livelihood opportunity. Now these of course are similar to the needs of the local youth that are hosting refugee communities. Many would, as I said, these are probably global priorities for for youth across the world. However, the impact of being forcibly displaced, being separated from one's family in many instances, the lack of social networks, and the absence of legal recourse that I mentioned earlier, makes refugee youth even more vulnerable in this sense. This is a study that was done, but again, I'm conscious of time. Now, if we take the two elements, the learning and the earning parts. So in MENA in particular, the provision of education in the region is very differentiated. We have conditions in Jordan, for instance, for Syrian refugees, whereby all refugees are allowed to enter Jordanian schools. When the Iraqi influx in 2006 and 2007 took place throughout the region, Iraqi refugees were also allowed access to Syrian schools, and likewise in Jordan and in Lebanon. However, the situation is unfortunately not standardized, and this is what I meant earlier about the policies being arbitrary and not predictable. The case is not the same for Sudanese refugees, for instance, in many of these countries. Neither is the case for refugees in Egypt, where Sudanese children are allowed access to public schools, whereas refugees of other nationalities are not. So here we see an imbalance in access that is an issue of concern, I believe. Yes, so in countries like Egypt, for instance, where there aren't any specifically allocated schools for refugees, or they are not allowed in general access to public education, there are many barriers in addition to that legislative gap to them being allowed access directly. So we have language barriers. Many of the refugees do not speak Arabic. Cultural barriers, the cost of education in many cases inhibits parents from sending their kids to school. Distance, because of the urban nature of the asylum, many of them live far away from the schools that they would be seeking to get into, and many of them do not have the documentation that they would need in order to be able to access the school, and this poses another barrier. Now, if we look at employment and livelihoods, youth in MENA in general represent a very high proportion of the total population, with persisting challenges of unemployment and underemployment, right? Many reports have indicated that almost 23% of people in MENA are unemployed. And this is one of the worst areas of the world for youth who are trying to find employment. And this is not just a recent phenomenon, this has been the case for several years now, at least a decade. So again, just another figure, almost young people in MENA were about 4 times as likely to be unemployed as older workers. Okay, so now on the employment front, there is more consistency between countries in the region, because they all don't allow refugees to work. So it's consistency, but not the kind that we would like, let's say. So most refugees end up working in the informal economy, in the shadow economy, informal market, shadow economy, menial tasks, despite many of them being university professors, doctors, engineers, etc. But their legal inability to exercise these professions mean that they end up doing other things. And oftentimes the conditions of work are exploitative, abusive, unregulated, and undignified. Now, in terms of service provision by the international community to address the gaps in terms of education and in terms of employment, in my opinion, it's a structure that kind of incentivizes vulnerability. It encourages people to rely on the assistance the very little assistance that is being provided by the international community in the form of UN agencies or NGOs, as opposed to encouraging proactivity in a search for alternatives. So it creates a relation of dependency as opposed to self-reliance. And referrals for informal or irregular employment are not even standardized, and they are not regulated. So there is a lot of room for, I think, revising the structures of assistance in this context. So my policy recommendations in general would be that we have to look at the wider political dimension of what is happening in the region and try to tag on to other groups, because the refugee advocacy community in MENA is there, and it's a growing one, but it is not as well established as many other advocacy groups, such as human rights groups or child rights groups, etc. So I think there would be an interest in sort of latching on to existing advocacy groups, particularly on children in this context, and to pushing that agenda forward. I think we also need to navigate carefully through the changing landscape between the expansion made available for human rights advocacy and the retraction that we see continually in the region, especially in the countries that have undergone revolutions, and where youth have found, and there's a newfound political voice that youth have found, and that should be tapped into and made more effective. Policies towards refugee youth in MENA, I think, should be more holistic and be more participatory, in the sense that the input of youth has to be much more incorporated, and women in particular, refugee girls and refugee youth, have to have a greater say than they currently do. And I think it's also important to bridge the relief to development gap that we see in many instances where refugees are considered this temporary presence, and they are not included as part of the wider developmental plans of any of the host countries. So I think this is an important point to think about. And we also need to work through both formal and informal structures at improving the policies and legislation, hopefully, that would become in place for refugees and asylum seekers in Arab countries, and codify existing positive practices where they do exist.
Thank you, Shana.
You should escape, huh?
ايوه صح So the last presentation will be in Egypt, refugees and policies. As you know, Egypt is one of the oldest countries and the oldest civilizations in the world. Egyptians usually say Masr Dunya, which means Egypt is the mother of the world. Throughout history, Egypt and especially Cairo has enjoyed the status of a cosmopolitan city attracting diverse populations from across the globe. Refugees have not constituted a significant share of its residents, but Egypt was seen as a place of exile by refugee populations such as Armenians in 1915 and Palestinians after 1948 and the Sudanese in 1983. During the period of President Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 50s and 60s, Egypt was host to exiles from liberation movements across Africa, called the African countries, which tried to liberate from the colonialism, and that was resulting in only small numbers of political activities. In 1990s, there were wars in the Horn of Africa, so there was an influx of refugees in Egypt during that decade, and also after the invasion of Kuwait by the Iraqi army in 1990, and also the war in Iraq in 2003 and the American invasion to Iraq. Refugees preferred Egypt as a stable country and as an attractive destination on account of one of the largest resettlement programs in the world. I have to jump because I have only 10 minutes and that. Where do refugees in Egypt live? Usually refugees in Egypt, first I have to say that there are more than 200,000 refugees in Egypt. They live in urban cities, mainly in Cairo and Alexandria. Often they share the same living conditions with poor Egyptians, finding accommodation in poor neighborhoods in Cairo. We have to look to the context of the local conditions because Egypt as a host country has numerous problems which prevent the country from fully integrating refugees in its borders. According to the UNDP Human Development Index, Egypt is categorized as a lower middle income country because Egypt suffers from two main problems: high rates of literacy and population growth. There is an important question which we have to discuss. Who is, if we look at the rights-based paradigm, who is in charge of protecting refugees? How can refugees access their rights and where can they claim justice? Egypt, there are many international conventions to which Egypt is a signatory and which provide a context for refugee rights as human rights. Egypt has been generous in opening its borders to refugees, especially those coming from neighboring countries. However, in terms of access to rights and possibility of local immigration. They are, I have to say first that the option of granting refugee citizenship is not possible given Egypt's large population. The central policy of the government is to offer refugees temporary residence building on one of two durable solutions, either resettlement or repatriation. As for refugees' children, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, or the UNHCR office in Cairo, is the only agency in Cairo that works for the refugees' children in general and the children who separated from their parents in particular. It provides to them health care and the primary education, but many of them suffer from many problems such as being used or the bad living conditions, etc. If we look to the period of the former President Hosni Mubarak, especially in the last 5 years, we can conclude that refugees in Egypt have endured roughly 5 years of protection crisis before, because there was arbitrary detention and the United Nations High Commission for Refugees' relationship with refugees in Egypt has been strained, marked by repeated incidents of protests and occasional violence. There is also smuggling from the borders to Israel and mostly from Africa, and that they suffer from many problems from both sides, either Egypt or Israel. If we look at the period after the revolution of January 25, we have some optimism. On April 2011, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, expressed hope for a new beginning for refugee protection in Egypt. He said that despite the tragedies of recent years, today we can begin to imagine a situation in which refugees who flee to Egypt might enjoy all of their rights guaranteed to them under international law. But unfortunately, the wave of protest against authoritarianism in the Arab world continued and has produced a large forced migration into Egypt from Libya and Syria. While this imposes substantial burdens on Egypt, it also focuses the world's attention to the problems in those countries. As for South Sudan, it has become a fully independent state now, and that I think that it was one of the largest groups of refugees in Egypt. They may now have improved prospects for repatriation. And now, to share responsibility from the new regime of Egypt, it's necessary to take advantage of flexibility built into the international law. An effective strategy needs to address these pictures of the new president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, and the new prime minister, Hisham Mandi. We need to think creatively about the rules to be played by the government of Egypt and also the United Nations and the international community. I think that Shadin spoke about the rights to education and some other rights, right to work and health care. But I want to say that the right of the refugee's child to access schools has to take into account that the government of Egypt is unable to provide access to schools for every Egyptian child. And if we also look to the right to work, we can't ask the Egyptian government to recognize employment for refugees when it is not formalized for Egyptians. Hence, the key question here remains, in an informal economy, what does the right to work mean?
So, كده بقى
ايوه كده امشي كده صح
من بعد القذافة.
ايوه خليك مع القذافي
كمان
يلا
Right to work. So I said that there is an informal economy in Egypt, which about 30 or 40% of the Egyptian economy.
No, you're going back. Yes. Yes.
So right to health care, there is a Caritas, which is an NGO organization. It's a very important organization in that regard, because refugees are considered foreigners in terms of access to services, including the health care. So Caritas helps the Egyptian government and UNHCR to find a solution to the problem of health care in governmental initiatives toward refugees. There is now a National Council for Childhood and Motherhood, which has been behind this many initiatives, and I think that there are also some initiatives by the NGOs in recent years. There are an increase of the number of the organizations that provide some assistance for refugees. In conclusion, I want to refer to a number of observations. It might be asked whether rights and access to these rights can be guaranteed to refugees in a country with a poor record of human rights protection for its own citizens, as it was the case during Mubarak's era. Hopefully that will change in the next year with the new regime. The second observation is the multiplicity of actors involved in protection and promotion of refugee rights makes the system highly inefficient, with the diffusion of the locus of accountability and responsibility. And last, for the right-based approaches in the policy making and implementation to be fully operationalized, all actors involved should be made aware of the meaning of these approaches. Where necessary, human rights and rights-based training should be provided for all actors involved in the policy making and implementation, as well as in the provision of protection and assistance. Thank you all. And now I have to open the door for discussion from the floor. Yes, please. Could you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Mohammed Jouni from the Initiative Youth Without Borders from Berlin, Germany. And I have a question to Mrs. Fayyaz. While you were talking about the situation in Jordan, it sounds very unbelievable, and it sounds, if you compare it with the situation in the UK and in Germany maybe, it sounds like the paradise for refugees. So would you tell me, is it a political decision, or is it a religious decision, or a social decision to protect refugees and give them these social benefits, or yes?
I won't dare to say it's a paradise for them, because no matter what we do for them, it's still not enough. But it's all these issues together. Yes, we share the same social, cultural. This is one source of why we help them. This is one source, the religion, everything we show them. Some of them, even our families, split between Syria and Jordan. So they're part of their families. They share the same family name. Now, there is a lot of help that's coming from donor agencies too, in regard to the money. So, and policies also, they help. We don't mind, the policies don't mind to allow any child to attend schools. It doesn't mind to allow them health immunization. So I guess all of these together work together to make them help better, but I won't dare to say it's the paradise, because if you see the conditions, well, it's far away from this.
You said also that Jordan is a small country with
Very
small
limited resources.
But rich countries like the UK and Germany are not able to help these refugees in our countries. So what's going on?
I think we're doing a lot,
European
and
Union.
as I said, a lot of things that makes it easier for Jordanian to help Syrian. It's like you're helping part of your family. It's not an issue of somebody who you see as an alien. He's not an alien from the beginning. He's part of your family. A lot of the families, they are split between Syria, and they have the same family name. So we feel like they're family. So the issue of dispositions about them and being aliens is not there from the beginning. The second issue is that we're getting help from other donors in regard to money. The policies itself, they help in helping them. So I know it sounds, I wanted to think of, not the empty part of the glass. I wanted to think of the full part, because we need to be optimistic about what is being achieved up to now to these children and what is needed to be achieved. But because we always start with what is missing, I think it gives us a very bad feeling that we cannot do more. So I wanted to start with something that we already did and we can do more, because we can reach up to more, to a larger number of these.
Excuse me, I hope to have all the questions and then we can.
Okay.
So, Dr. Muhammad.
I have some inquiries to Medved. You've done very good work, and I like your presentation. But I have 2 points. One, I am a little worried about the future relationship between refugees and public and the Jordanians. Simply because I know, or I read somewhere that these refugees enter the labor market, compete with the opportunities
Yes,
to work, and this may reduce the living wages. So the public will be against the ordinary people. I don't want the ordinary people to be against the refugees,
Yeah.
because that is not in favor, in their interest actually. The second, that from your presentation, it is very clear that you have lack of resources. How about the Arab, rich Arab countries, the Arab exporting countries like Saudi Arabia, Gulf State? Do they help?
I guess they do.
It's
Yes,
not
they
enough.
do. I can't.
It's not enough.
Probably, the more you help, it's always not enough. The help is not enough, because we're having the numbers are rising every day. So it's always not enough. But I think they do help in regard to the monetary resources. As far as the labor.
Labor and the easy marriage, something like that. Some
Easy-
Jordanian try to get married from Syrian under this condition. Yeah.
But I guess they had a law that prevents them from doing so. It's not a law, I guess, in في قانون إنه يمنعهم هلا إنه يتزوجوا. There is a law that prevents
This
them
is
from.
Very good.
Against the human rights.
No, it's not like because they don't give dowries. It's a different issue, because they want them to give dowries for these brides, because they take advantage of their conditions. So they made it clear that you have to give them dowries and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's why.
Question, last question.
As for the
Roy,
labor
Roy.
work, yes, we have, a lot of the commons have concerns in regard to that. But what works, we had a labor, Syrian labor, before the crisis.
I see.
So we had a lot of Syrians working in Jordan before even the crisis began.
But it's increasing now.
It's increasing, there are concerns, and your concern might spread over among the commons. We don't know what's going to happen, but up to now, the picture is good. We don't want to look at the bad side of everything.
Roy, your presentation analysis was excellent, and you end up with the recommendation. my question is, what do you do in order to convince the policymakers in the United Kingdom to apply your recommendation? How do you advocate your policymakers? It's not enough to say
No,
we need,
after all
we
the
need.
question.
It's not enough to say that we need to do so and so and so. But we need to
I
apply.
will answer after everyone.
Yes, Kirsten, please, and then.
I just wanted to raise a theme that maybe came out of these responses. Is it seems that we're talking about exclusion and otherness, and maybe Jordan is an example of where they're not, refugees are not so much seen as the other. But it seems that a lot of the conversation is always then directed at the refugee. And if we see this, of course, being in Europe, that everyone's talking about how multiculturalism has failed. But part of the problem is that refugees are not let in to the system, that they're still seen as very much a part. And so I wonder, in all these discussions, how we might talk about these kinds of issues, not in terms of the refugee as the focus and as the problem, but as the host society. What is it that the host society? And I'm not talking about law either. I'm talking about what culturally to a greater extent. Than the law can say all kinds of things that really doesn't lead to any sort of integration. And often what I see here, maybe Carla can speak to this in terms of being myself from outside, that it's very much about this sort of in Europe seeing themselves as tolerant as long as you follow our rules, right? As long as you assimilate, we're very tolerant of you. But if you don't, if you remain too other, and at the same time there are not people being sort of accepted. So I think there's this, we maybe need to turn our focus, and in that regard, maybe we can learn a lot from children who seem to be a bit better at this sort of thing than adults. So I just wanted to note that pattern.
I observed that all those who handle the problem of the refugees are talking about the host country rules. Unfortunately, the problem of refugees, we cannot blame the host countries in all cases, especially in Arab countries, because those host countries are full of problems by themselves. And we cannot blame the refugees themselves because the problem is out of their freedom. We have to look from international point of view, why we can cooperate in solving those problems. No one can blame Jordan or Egypt because Egypt is full of its main problem. How about refugees are coming from Sudan? For Jordan, with limited resources, are coming. Syrian are coming. Iraqi are coming. Palestinians are coming. Let us talk together or find an international cooperation to help those problems instead of blaming or condemning any individual countries about these problems.
Amani?
Yes, I agree with Dr. Just to have to stop blaming the victims. And at the same time, I have two questions. The first one, out of your presentation, do you have an impression that there is what's named the coherent policy towards refugees in general? And what is the difference between MENA area and is there a specific difference between Dutch and England cases in dealing with the refugee or not? I mean, can we talk about coherent European policy towards the refugee or not? And if not, to what extent there is a great difference even between the state and another? And related to the question of Mohammed, I don't blame Jordanian or at least, just address any criticism or even approval for their policy, but the case is if we are talking or politically speaking, can we talk about what's named one policy towards the refugee? I mean, suppose that the refugee were not from Syria and they were from South Sudan. Do you think that Jordanian government will he act the same and take the same, just actions or policy toward them or not? Yeah, that is like.
Yes, please, would you introduce yourself, please? Yeah,
Allah, can we start to wrap up too?
yes, but we started late, so yeah.
We don't want to push everyone too hard.
We need only 10 minutes and we, yes.
Good afternoon, my name is Ibrahim Khan from Germany. I want to ask something about the feelings of refugees, because we have spoken about some rights, special education, health and work. We have similar problems also in Europe, and maybe another part is something about freedom.
Yeah.
But for me it's really important how people are treated, because in UK, in EU or in Germany, usually the problem not really the access to social benefits. The most important thing is for me to be treated with dignity. And most of people have great or remarkable problems with having dignity. And how is the situation in the Arab world or in Jordan or Egypt? That would be for me very interesting.
Yes, please.
It's a bit late in the day, I apologize, but can we actually raise the issue of cause? At the moment, Turkey has got 25,000 Syrian refugees who moved in virtually overnight. The Turkish government accommodated that group of people of refugees because they recognise that the Syrian conflict is a war, effectively. They have problems because a lot of the people would they would see as being Kurdish, and the Kurdish problem in Turkey is immense. But the Turkish government has waived their objections to an influx of Turkish people because they recognise this conflict. We are talking about wars here. Iraqi, Iran have been involved in wars, I don't know, post-colonial, neo-colonial wars for the past 100 years, and there's been a lot of displaced people. So please can we distinguish between economic migrants or refugees or asylum seekers, because the reasons why people move are varied. And on the basis that Jordan has welcomed refugees in terms of the Syrian conflict, maybe there's a question that would they recognise them as being migrants, and economic migrants, and put up barriers. In terms of the UK, we accept economic migrants if there is a case for employment, but we reject victims of conflict because we don't know which side they're on, because as a nation, the UK at the moment is involved in a neo-colonial, post-colonial war in the Middle East, and has been for some while. So consequently, when somebody who comes to our country as an asylum seeker, we are very unclear as to whether or not that person is a friend or a foe. On demonstrating that border, that line between someone we welcome or somebody we reject, is very difficult in practice to define. So under the basis of a kind of humanitarian impulse about victims of conflict, it's a completely different impulse to a response to an economic migrant. And maybe we should start thinking about the causes of why people travel.
Okay, thank you. You, please. You have a question?
Yeah, I was just there. I mean, there are a lot of things being mentioned in the panel discussion, but one of the things that I was wondering about is that both of you and also you mentioned that there's a lack of mental health support, and I was wondering whether locally this is supported, and if so, through what, like NGOs? Is there any international support? And if this is actually an important aspect within, if I can say so, this conflict, because we're talking about children, and this is definitely a very important aspect also for the upcoming generations. I'm just wondering, is this really, like, is there a lot of importance on this aspect?
Any more questions? No. The last question for Dr. Negla.
One question for Carla, please. You mentioned in your presentation that in the Netherlands, refugees must move, who live in refugee camps, they must move every year. Is it by law to do that, or they don't feel safe, or they don't like to change?
So 2 or 3 minutes for every speaker.
You want me to start?
Yes.
First of all, in how to lobby the British government over the asylum policies, we have a very strong coalition of NGOs that work on this. We have a very good refugee council that also lobbies and is involved in policy making. Since 1999, we have had 6 major immigration and asylum policy reviews in the UK, the last one being in 2009, so it's constantly being reviewed. And as we speak, there's an inquiry into the human rights of asylum seekers, particularly minors, and they're accepting submissions up to 26th of October. So all of us are submitting all our concerns and worries, and the British government's actually undergoing that inquiry, with the results hopefully published later on, and hopefully we will be able to affect policy. One of the main problems is the fact that support is not uniform, particularly where children are concerned. It's up and down. So, and that is a funding issue. So it's how seriously the government will take it to be able to offer the same amount of funding to all local authorities, and then how that is allocated to children in particular. But there are a lot of NGOs that work with them, and because immigration policies in the UK have been a bit erratic and a bit crazy at times, and when they realise it's wrong, then they've changed it. So the church is involved in a lot of work, and there are a lot of small NGOs that have been set up in charities to help where governments fail. So Britain in general is run by a lot of charity support. There are a lot of charities that help in various aspects, so that's one way of doing it. Kristen made a point about what is a cultural policy. I don't know if she's here or not. We've had various policies in Europe. There isn't a coherent policy in Europe. EU doesn't have a coherent policy. They are all signatory to the international conventions, but we have national laws that allows how that is interpreted. Again, we've had lots of child welfare acts in England that allows that interpretation to be national, but then that's different to France, that's different to, as we've heard, Netherlands, and to Germany, and to various other countries. And on this question, the French believe that if you come to live in France, you will assimilate, you will become like us, you will take a scarf off, you will do this, you know. In England, they've gone the other way. In England, they actually support and give funding for you to maintain your cultural identity. They believe it's important for you to maintain your cultural identity. But post 9/11 and post the bombings in England in 2007, where we've had terrorist acts and it's been blamed on political Islam, the way that Britain is now moving towards the French model. And we don't have one success story to say whether the French is right or the British is right. So somewhere in the middle would probably be the right way of doing it, but it's a problem. Mental health issue, yes, it's an important matter that comes up, but we have governments that are providing mental health support, but it's not adequate, and children don't know how to access it unless they've got a good foster carer or a good legal guardian that will facilitate their access to the services. It is not readily available to them. So it's a very important matter, particularly when it comes to the fact that as soon as they reach 18 in the UK, they will be deported if they haven't been recognized as refugees. So their mental state actually affects how they cope during the time that they're there. So it is a very important aspect of that. I just want to make 2 points about our experience in Iran with refugees. Iran actually is a major host to refugees. We have the largest, over 1 million Afghanis and Iraqis who live in Iran. And the Afghanis have been there since 1989, since 1979 rather, when all the problems in Afghanistan have started. And I just hope that it doesn't go the way of Iran with all the new countries that are now hosting, because in Iran, Afghanis are excluded. They are not included. Their children are not allowed into normal schools. They're not allowed employment. And in the last few months, we've had horrendous stories of towns actually physically removing Afghanis who have settled in cities out of the cities into border camps with Afghanistan. So families that have settled over 20, 25 years within towns have forcibly been removed from towns into these, because they want to repatriate them. So that's a major concern. And a point of warning to the wonderful revolutionary Arab Spring and all the excitement about the hopeful things, the good things that are going to happen. In 1997, we had our own form of the youth and the young voting in a so-called pro-reform president in Iran, President Khatami, who the world wooed and the doors to finance and investment in Iran opened because they thought this is a smiling mullah, this is not a threatening mullah. Within 2 years of him being in power, asylum seeking from Iran increased by tenfold. In year 1999, Britain, Germany, other European countries had on average about 570, 600 applications a year. In year 2000, when I did my research, 5,750 applications were made to the United Kingdom, the same in Germany. So I hope that they will deliver. If they don't deliver, you are going to see the same kind of exodus out of the countries into Europe. And Europe, you better open your eyes and ears. You have something coming your way.
I had a question about if Jordan has the same policy toward all refugees. I don't know. I don't think we have a coherent policy, but we have different kinds of refugees. If we talk about Palestinian refugees, we do have a very, very clear policy toward Palestinians. They have the same rights as Jordanians. I am a Palestinian refugee myself. I have studied in Jordanian schools. I never felt, I work in all the institutions. I had all the rights that my Jordanian fellow had. So we have a very clear policy toward the Palestinian refugees. In regard to Iraqis, we treated them the same way we're treating Syrians. But I guess policies are getting restricted the more we recognize that our resources are getting restricted too. So the question is, if we don't get the help from the donor agencies, is it possible for us to provide these refugees with the same things that we want to? We have the will, but we are limited in resources. What can we do? But we are willing to. We're open to it. But if we are very limited in resources, what can we do to them? So it's a very complicated issue. It's not only about policies. I think it has other issues too.
Sheldon?
Thank you. On the same point about the compatibility or consistency of policies, I think there are huge gaps in the region. As I was saying earlier, it's because of this lack of national legislation that makes for such big differences in how people are treated. And at the same time, they're also oftentimes very politicized policies. So when it's suitable or convenient for a certain government to open its doors to refugees of a particular origin, they are open, but when it's not, they are closed. We have many instances, for example, of certain nationalities being kicked out of countries because of the politics of their own leadership. For instance, Palestinians in Libya were kicked out when Gaddafi was unhappy with decisions that Yasser Arafat was making at the time. Or likewise, a lot of the Egyptians in Kuwait, in Iraq, were kicked out when the positions of the government of their origin were not suit the host government. So this is the unpredictability and the gaps that I was mentioning earlier because of lack of standardization. In terms of the assimilation question, I think, Doctor, your question was about international support. There's definitely international support for that, but the responsibility falls, in my opinion, both on the refugees themselves, the host communities, as well as the international community. So it's a triangle of responsibility, I believe. On the mental health support for refugees in the region, in Egypt, for instance, there is access to NGOs that do provide psychosocial assistance. There are a number of them that are charity-based or that receive funding from external sources that do provide psychosocial and mental support for refugee children. They're small, they're limited, but they are present.
Just quick about the practical question, why the children have to move every year is I think because our fascination with bureaucracy. Half of the moves are because of the child enters a new phase in the asylum procedure. So first, at the beginning, you have 3 phases, and then you have to move every time. In the end, there are also 3, and then in between moves are because the centers are closed, because mostly the reception centers have just a few years contract with the local authorities. Of course, it's not necessary. You can also choose to leave people to a standardized place. But I think it's a policy of keeping people uprooted to don't feel, to destabilize. But I know it's not allowed to say that. About EU standards, common policies, there are quite a few initiatives to try to come to a more coherent policy. I've brought some examples about a project. We've come to standards for guardians of separated children. With 10 EU countries, we spoke with hundreds of guardians and separated children, asked them, what do you think your guardian should do, what should he know, how should he behave, and then we came to kind of draft standards, and it's now in an implementation phase. I brought the information about that, and with Mr. Kahn from Germany and the human dignity, you said maybe it's more important to talk about that than about access to rights.
No.
Did I understand you well? No.
Actually, I was asking about the situation in Arab world or Near East because I know more or less the situation in UAE. You have access, it's not sufficient, it's not enough. But on the other side, especially in Germany, maybe that's the particular the right to movement and how you are treated is really important. So I was asking how it is in the other countries because you can take dignity or freedom and only say access to health, to work or to education. I think both parts are, you can't take only one part. You have to take everything and whole picture.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why I brought the decision of the European Committee on Social Rights. It's about a complaint we lodged as Defense for Children at the European Committee on Social Rights because in the Netherlands at the time there was a policy of leaving children on the street after their asylum procedure was ended. And that in that decision, the committee very beautiful explained how human dignity is completely connected with respect for basic human rights. And I just to give it a little bit of attention. I think it's very nice reading it. It's on our website, and I have one copy here. You can check it.
Okay, thank you. At the end of the session, I want to thank all the speakers and thank you all for attending the session. And I hope that it was useful for you all. Have a great day and see you tomorrow. Thank you.